Most CPUs have integrated graphics. Unless you have one of those Intel F CPUs or an older AMD CPU, then the chances are you have a GPU built into your CPU. But if you're like most people, then you probably have a dedicated GPU, so your iGPU is just kind of sitting there doing nothing during gaming. So what if there was a way to utilize the iGPU and dedicated GPU together to increase your performance in games? Well, in this video, we're going to utilize lossless scaling's dual GPU mode for frame generation on the iGPU. That means our dedicated GPU will play games, while our iGPU will generate extra frames with no base FPS loss. There are two CPUs we will test. We will test an AMD APU, specifically the Ryzen 7 8700G, with Radeon 780M graphics, and in graphics tests it actually performs pretty well. And then we will test a Ryzen 7 7800X3D, which has just basic Radeon graphics. And these are probably the most common types of iGPU out there, but they really aren't powerful at all. They're included on pretty much every AM5 CPU like this 9900X as well. Surprisingly enough, this concept actually isn't new. Back whenever, you could actually crossfire an AMD APU with a GPU to get extra performance. But unsurprisingly, crossfire was discontinued because, let's be real, it sucked. You would get micro stuttering in games, you were severely restricted by the components that even supported it, and half of the games don't support it at all. So let's get our Ryzen 7 8700G and unbox that. We have our CPU cooler, which is pretty useful as a lot of CPUs don't actually include coolers. So if you're building a budget PC, then that can definitely save you some money. And then we have the CPU with a sticker in the tray. The Ryzen 7 8700G has 8 cores and 16 threads, a 4.2 GHz clock speed, 8 MB of level 2 cache with 16 MB of level 3 cache, a 65W TDP, and of course our Radeon 780M graphics. Since this is an AMD APU, we are sacrificing some of the CPU power for that iGPU. If we take a look at the pricing, the 8700G goes for about $269, but you can actually get a 7700X for slightly less than that, or you can get a 9700X for slightly more, both of which will perform better than the 8700G CPU wise. Let's plug this into our PC, and then we're going to see our graphics cards that we're going to be using to play the games. This is the AMD RX 9070 XT with 4096 stream processors, 16GB of GDDR6 memory, a clock speed of up to 3010 MHz, PCIe 5.0 x16, and plenty of ports including HDMI and DisplayPort, which we won't actually be using for lossless scaling. We're using 32GB of Corsair 6000 megatransfers per second RAM in dual channel, and that's pretty important in AMD APUs as our iGPU will need to access the RAM to use as video memory. Dual channel is generally required to increase our bandwidth, and the speed and the amount of RAM should be good enough for our iGPU. So let's get our RAM and GPU plugged in, and our display cable goes into our motherboard, not the GPU. After installing the drivers, we pretty much run into our first problem, which is that games don't want to load on the GPU when we have a display connected to our motherboard. I plugged another monitor into the GPU and it mostly fixed the issue, although there was some stuttering when playing games on the display connected to our motherboard. If we plugged our display directly into the GPU, we had no problems at all, but for lossless scaling running on the iGPU, we can't really do that. Well, I mean, technically we can, as shown here, but you will notice when lossless scaling is turned on using the iGPU, our base FPS decreases by some frames. This is not ideal as we want to keep our base FPS to improve our FPS using the iGPU. If you get no display from your motherboard while your GPU is plugged in, then you may have to go to your BIOS and change the initial display output to iGPU or the integrated graphics just to make sure that's on. Now we can launch Red Dead Redemption 2 at 4K max settings with MSAA x4. Here we get about 41.5 FPS on average, with pretty bad 1% and 0.1% lows in the 20s. The game itself is very playable like this on the 9070 XT. We could easily turn down or off MSAA and it will be getting over 60 FPS. But let's see if frame generation on our Radeon 780M iGPU can increase our FPS instead. So I started off by setting the GPU to the 780M with LSFG 3.1 and a 2x multiplier with a 100 flow scale. I was fully not expecting this to work well as we are using a 100 flow scale which requires a lot of GPU power at 4K. But to my surprise, we were doubling our FPS to the 80 to 90 FPS range, and the game felt very smooth. As you can see here, our base FPS did seem to drop down a little, but I'm unsure whether that was due to the variations in the game or lossless scaling itself. Around 90 generated FPS seems to be the max that the 8700G is capable of at 4K 100% flow scale. I knew this because I turned the game to the 3x multiplier and it was 3xing a lower base FPS. Turning down the flow scale to the recommended 50 at 4K and 3x worked great. It was only using about 70% of the iGPU. 5x was a bit too much again, but 4x worked great, giving us us about 160 FPS on average. The iGPU reached into the 90% usage range, but the game still felt very smooth and more than playable. At 1080p we were averaging 114.5 base FPS at the same settings, and the max we could really do was turn on 2 times at 100 flow scale to get about 240 FPS, and that was only using about 77% usage. Even though we're at 1080p, 3x was slightly too high here as our base FPS is very high, so it would be generating a lot of frames. We could get 3x by turning down the flow scale, but you would be sacrificing some quality. Honestly, you probably don't even need 360 FPS though. I then tried Forza, the extreme preset 8x MSAA at 4K. This game is really well optimized, so we're able to get 72.5 FPS on average. I first started by putting the flow scale at 50, which is still really good at 4K, and I had the multiplier on 2 times. Because our base FPS is quite high here, our iGPU wouldn't be able to handle 100 flow scale at 4K. This worked really well, giving us 120 generated FPS, while using only about 80% of the iGPU. Just a thing to note here is that the base cap is limited to 60 FPS or 60Hz, and that's the limitation of my monitor at 4K. So that's why we only see 120 FPS at 2 times instead of 140 or more. The 3 times multiplier at 50 flow scale was unfortunately too much, however, as frame generation could no longer keep up. Turning down the flow scale to 25 allowed us to get 180 FPS at 3 times, but the game does start to look a bit weird. At 1080p we got 149.2 FPS. 2 times multiplier at 100 flow scale worked very well to give us 240 FPS, as our base FPS is capped at 120Hz, also the limitation of the monitor. Like Red Dead Redemption 2, 3 times is too much unless we turn down the flow scale to 75, as our base FPS is very high. GTA 5 at max settings 1080p with MSAA x 8 gives us 115.4 FPS. 2 times at 100 flow scale works great, giving us about 200 generated frames. For some reason it does seem to be dropping our base FPS here. Anything higher than about 3 times seems to be too much at 100 flow scale, but because our base FPS kept dropping down to like the 80 to 90 range, it was actually keeping up at 240 FPS. At 4K we were getting 35.8 base FPS, and we could easily do 2 times at 100 flow scale because our base FPS is so low. We could even reach 4 times, giving us about 160 generated FPS before the iGPU couldn't handle it anymore. Shadow of the Tomb Raider at 4K highest settings with SMAA 4 times got 49 FPS on average. Obviously the anti-aliasing here is keeping the FPS quite low. We could turn on the 2 times multiplier to get 80-ish FPS at 100 flow scale, or better yet we could turn it down to 50 and use the 3 times multiplier for 120 to 150 FPS. The 4 times multiplier works well when the base FPS was about 40, but if the base increased to about 50 FPS then it couldn't 4x it anymore, and the game became less smooth, so 3x at 50 flow scale 4K is good here. I tried Resident Evil 3 at max everything including SMAA. We had 332 FPS on average, which is a lot. I tried 3x at 100 flow scale, but the iGPU was unable to keep up because our base FPS is way too high. At 75 flow scale we could get 360 generated FPS, but obviously this made no sense anyway because we pretty much had the same FPS without frame gen. There's no point using frame gen if we have a huge base FPS, because, well, first, you don't even need it, and second, it would actually make the game feel worse here, because it's only generating frames from 120 FPS. It was pretty much the same thing at 4K. Although we now had a lower base FPS of 122, I could only scale it from 60 due to the limitations of my monitor. And because our iGPU isn't the most powerful, it could only scale up to about 120 FPS at 4K with 50 flow scale. I'm sure if we had a less powerful GPU, then lossless scaling would be very useful here. Okay, so our Ryzen 7 8700G iGPU is pretty capable of running lossless scaling for some low multiplier frame generation at 1080p, and even some at 4K, but I imagine most people don't have an AMD APU in their PC. If you're like me, then you probably just have standard integrated graphics like on this Ryzen 7 7800X3D. You wouldn't usually even think of gaming with this iGPU, but for some light gaming, it does actually work. Similar to the 8700G, it has 8 cores with 16 threads, a 4.2 GHz clock speed, 8 MB of level 2 cache, but being an X3D processor, we actually have a massive 96 MB of level 3 cache. It has a 120 watt TDP, and just standard AMD Radeon graphics with pretty much no name. So let's get that connected to our PC and we can launch Red Dead Redemption 2 again. We have the game on the exact same settings as before, and we do get slightly more FPS at 49.8 due to the 7800X3D being more powerful than the 8700G. I have lossless scaling set to use the iGPU, and I turned on LSFG 3.1 with the 2 times multiplier at 50 flow scale. This went about as well as it should have done. i.e. terrible, the iGPU could not keep up at all, even at 50 flow scale. We were getting like 28 base FPS scaled to 56, which is not what we want at all. Additionally, the game felt extremely stuttery. I had no choice but to turn down the flow scale to the lowest at 25, and even then it was not keeping up, and the game did not look good. At 1080p, we did get better results. Our base FPS was at 115.5, and we could turn on the 2x multiplier at 25 flow scale to get 240 FPS. However, turning the flow scale up to 50 was too demanding for our iGPU. The problem is that our base FPS is too high at 1080p for our iGPU to multiply even by 2 times, but at 4K, our iGPU can't even handle the 4K frame generation. Also, during this, the iGPU is pretty much maxed out at 100%, which causes the game to feel less smooth. Forza at 4K gave us 87.4 FPS on average, and there was pretty much nothing we could do at 4K with frame generation. The 2x multiplier at the lowest 25 flow scale was not scaling properly. It was going from 40 to 80 FPS. At 1080p, our FPS was very high at 173.7. We could 2x our FPS with 25 flow scale to 240 FPS, but honestly this game was just better without frame generation here. GTA 5 at 4K was averaging 42 FPS, and like before, we couldn't turn on frame generation at 2x, even at 25 flow scale. Unless the FPS dipped to around the 30 range, then we could get about 60 FPS. At 1080p, we were averaging 141.4 FPS, which again is very high, so we could turn our 2x multiplier, but only at 25 flow scale, and that got us about 240 FPS. Honestly, the game doesn't look that great at 25 flow scale, so I'm starting to think that the iGPU in the Ryzen 7 7800X 3D is not really good for frame generation. Shadow of the Tomb Raider at 4K got 58 FPS, and there was pretty much nothing we could do with frame generation at 4K with the 7800X 3D iGPU. Although our average FPS at 1080p was 125, we could actually put the 2x multiplier on with 50 flow scale, because at some points in the game the FPS dips to about 80, so we can get about 160 generated FPS. Yet again, in Resident Evil 3, the FPS was just way too high, so turning on frame generation doesn't even make sense. So the problem I think we have here is number 1, while the iGPU in the 7800X 3D is pretty bad. But number 2, and most importantly, the GPU we are using is powerful enough by itself. We get way too much FPS in 4K and 1080p for iGPU to multiply our frames by any amount. While the 8700G iGPU can do frame generation, it still isn't really ideal as the multiplier amounts are very low. We should really be using another more budget-friendly GPU like this RTX 3050, and this makes much more sense because a lot of people using a budget GPU would want to get more FPS without spending extra money. If you have like a 5090, let's say, then you're just going to play the games natively or turn down some of the settings and you will easily get 240 FPS, no frame generation even required. So let's do some tests again with the RTX 3050 instead, and now it seems to make more sense to use your iGPU for frame generation. Yes, even with the 7800X 3D graphics. So let's just swap that out and we have Red Dead Redemption 2 running again with the 7800X 3D and the RTX 3050. We're running the game at ultra settings but with no MSAA at 1080p, and we get 39.1 FPS on average. Here we could actually turn on the 2x multiplier at 1080p with 100 flow scale to double our FPS to the 80s range. Unfortunately, 3x was too much and we were maxing out the iGPU unless we turned the flow scale down to like 50, and then we could get over 100 FPS. So it now looks like the iGPU in the 7800X 3D is actually slightly useful, because we can scale at 1080p as long as our base FPS isn't too high. At 1440p, I had to turn the settings down to high to get 41.8 FPS, but because our base FPS isn't too high, I could actually turn on the 2x multiplier at 75 flow scale, which is the recommended at 1440p, and we were doubling our FPS into the 80s range again. Unsurprisingly, 3x didn't work though, unless we turned the flow scale down to like 40. So if you want to double your FPS using your basic iGPU, it is possible as long as your main GPU isn't too powerful. Next we have Forza at 1080p extreme settings with no MSAA. Here we were getting 47.9 FPS, which is pretty decent. 2x at 100 flow scale works well to give us over 100 FPS, but like in Red Dead Redemption 2, our iGPU couldn't handle 3x. At least not at 100 flow scale anyway. At 1440p we were dipping into the 30 FPS range, but that did make it easier on our frame generation. We still couldn't use 100 flow scale at 1440p, but 75 flow scale worked well to double our FPS to 70 to 80. GTA 5 at the highest settings 1440p had our base FPS over 60, so I turned on MSAA ×2 to try to decrease it slightly to 50 FPS. I started out with 100 flow scale at 2x and our iGPU could not handle that at all. However, 75 flow scale was good, giving us over 80 FPS, but if our base FPS FPS increased to about 50, then it could no longer keep up. So realistically, we need to use like 50 to 60 flow scale, which makes the game look not exactly terrible, but not exactly great either. For some reason in GTA 5 in all my tests, our base FPS actually does seem to be dropping when we turn on lossless scaling. I don't really know why it's happening, but this setup of lossless scaling on the iGPU and playing games on your graphics card is definitely far from perfect. At 1080p, our average FPS was 84.8, and that's pretty high, so at 2 times 100 flow scale, our iGPU could not handle it unless we turn the flow scale down to about 50. I don't particularly like turning the flow scale down when playing at 1080p just due to how the game looks. Shadow of the Tomb Raider at the highest preset 1080p, no anti-aliasing this time, gave us 63.1 FPS. Our FPS is pretty high here, so we couldn't use the 2 times multiplier at 100 flow scale, but if we turn down that flow scale, we could get 120 FPS. At 1440p, our FPS decreased to 43.2, and for our 2 times multiplier, we had to use a flow scale lower than 75 to double our FPS. 75 worked okay when the FPS was in the low 40s, but at certain points, the FPS will increase beyond this, and the iGPU can no longer keep up. In Resident Evil 3, we now have the shadow cache off and the texture settings turned down to high 0.25GB. At 1440p, we're only getting about 50 FPS, so we can easily double our frames to about 100 to 120 with the flow scale at 50. At 1080p, we got 75 FPS, and we could only double our FPS at 50 flow scale, because our FPS in certain areas would increase to about 90. It makes much more sense to use frame generation with your iGPU here, using the RTX 3050, than it does with the 9070 XT, as the base FPS is a lot lower. If we use the Ryzen 7 8700G iGPU with the RTX 3050, then it makes even more sense as we can actually do frame generation pretty well at 100 flow scale. At ultra settings 1080p with no MSAA, we could get 38.8 FPS in Red Dead Redemption 2. That's pretty similar to before with the 7800X3D, but now we can actually do frame generation at 2 times with 100 flow scale, all the way up to about 7 times to get 280 FPS at 100 flow scale. And even better yet, at this multiplier, we were only using around 80 to 90% of our iGPU, so the game felt really smooth and looked great too. At 1440p, I had to turn the game down to high so our RTX 3050 could handle it at 41.5 FPS. But we can easily double our frames here with frame generation at 100 flow scale. We're using the 3 times multiplier to get around 120 FPS. We could go all the way up to 5 times at 100 flow scale to get 200 FPS, or we could turn now the flow scale to 75 and do about 280 FPS with a 7 times multiplier. That's actually really good for a budget frame generation setup. Forza at 1080p extreme settings was getting 45.9 FPS, and we could do the 3 times multiplier at 100 flow scale to get 150 FPS, or we could go to about 6 times to get like 300 FPS, because our frame rate at times was increasing to the 50 to 60 range. At 1440p, our FPS drops to 38.8, which is fairly low, so we could just about turn on the 5 times multiplier with 100 flow scale to get about 200 FPS. However, having the flow scale at 75 with the 6 times multiplier and 240 FPS worked better. GTA 5 at Ultra 1440p with MSAA times 2 gave us 50.3 FPS. We could turn on lossless scaling at 3 times at 100 flow scale or 5 times at 75 flow scale whilst using less than 90% of the iGPU. At 1080p we were getting 79.4 FPS, and because our base FPS is pretty high here, we can multiply by 4 to get over 300 FPS, but we were nearing the 95% usage at times. Shadow of the Tomb Raider at 1080p was averaging 58 FPS, and the 5 times multiplier was pretty good to get about 250 FPS. The FPS goes up and down by quite a lot, so it's hard to get a good multiplier number here. At 1440p we now had 41.5 FPS, and the 7 times multiplier at 75 flow scale was about the max we could do, and that got us 280 FPS. Although when the FPS did increase at certain points, then our iGPU can no longer handle this multiplier. Resident Evil 3 at 1440p got 53.3 FPS. At about 4 times multiplier at 100 flow scale, the game works pretty well, but the FPS is kind of all over the place, so it's hard to get a good multiplier here. 75 flow scale with a 5 times multiplier is also decent to get like 250 FPS. At 1080p we could get a base FPS of 68.8, and we could only do about 3 times multiplier here at 100 flow scale, because at some points the game goes into like the 100 FPS range, giving us like 300 generated FPS. It seems you can use your iGPU for frame generation while having your games playing on your graphics card. Most of the standard integrated graphics are not great for performance and only tend to allow you to multiply by very low amounts. If you have a fairly powerful GPU and a basic iGPU, then I probably wouldn't even bother, because the iGPU can't even handle 2 times frame generation when the FPS is really high at 1080p. If you try at a higher resolution, which now gives you a lower FPS, then it still can't handle it because the resolution is now too high. It would honestly just be better to cap your FPS and run lossless scaling on the same GPU. If, on the other hand, you have an AMD APU with a fairly powerful GPU, then low multiplier amounts actually do work pretty well at most resolutions, as long as you change the flow scale accordingly. I imagine though most people won't have an APU if they have a pretty decent GPU, and I wouldn't go and buy one just for this because you can buy better CPUs for less money. Budget setups like our RTX 3050 work a lot better because our base FPS is pretty low, so you can actually do some frame generation on both iGPUs if you optimize your settings. I think most people using less powerful hardware would want to try and increase their FPS like this, so it does make much more sense. Like if you're upgrading from an AMD APU to get a dedicated graphics card, then you will already have a decent iGPU that can be used, otherwise it would just be wasted in the PC. The only thing is with AMD APUs is that you have to have decent enough RAM in dual channel to get the best performance. I don't think by using the iGPU we actually negatively affect our CPU's performance, mainly because our CPU is never actually being 100% utilized in any of the games. But playing on the graphics cards through the motherboard's DisplayPorts actually might decrease the FPS by a bit. I did a video on it before, but basically in that, playing through the motherboard's ports does seem to negatively affect FPS in games. But I think overall it still is a great way to get more FPS in games if you have a less powerful GPU. Thanks for watching.